Growing up, there was one birthday in particular that I was excited about more than any other birthday. And that's when I turned 16, because it meant two things. The first, that I could officially drive a car without a chaperone, which I was very excited about and did almost immediately when I turned 16. Number two is I could get what I consider to be a real job. Now, up until this point, I'd been working the last 3 summers for my grandmother, who ran her own real estate business. And it was really fun, and it was really great to spend time with my grandmother and get to know her through a work context and not just being my grandmother. And of course, she paid me, which was really lovely. But it was my grandmother. I didn't have to go through the usual process of applying and doing an interview and all of those things. I'm grateful for the experience because I learned how to answer phones and use a copier machine and use a fax machine. Remember fax machines? Do people still use those? Anyway, but when I turned 16, in my hometown in Wyoming, I could start applying for what I considered to be real jobs. So I did just that. Like a lot of my friends, I started applying at restaurants, fast food places, the few clothing stores that we had. And I was really excited to join the workforce and make my own money and have a little bit of independence because I had a car and I was gonna need to buy gas and I wanted to hang out with my friends more. Now, this was back in the day when, in order to apply for a job, you physically went into the job, filled out an application, gave them your resume, and met them in person. And then they would pass it on to whoever it was, and then you would get a phone call for an interview, and then you would go in for a real interview, and. Now, my friends were applying for a lot of the similar jobs as well. And after I put in all my applications, I went home and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And I never heard back from anyone. And I remember my friends were all getting jobs. Not only were they getting jobs, first they were getting interviews, and then they were getting the job. And I was left feeling really confused because I was just as qualified as they were. We all had the same qualifications. And in fact, with some of my friends, I had more experience because I had worked in an office for 3 summers. I couldn't even get an interview. And I remember feeling really confused, a little angry, and also a little sad, thinking, what's the deal here? Why aren't people interested in me? And I don't know this for 100%, but I'm pretty sure having a physical disability had something to do with it. My assumption is people didn't know what I was capable of, so instead of bringing me in for an interview and asking me directly, they didn't even give me a chance. And I could tell my family was a little frustrated, but then we found this government program in my hometown, incredible woman named Beth Whitman, who her job was to help someone like myself, a person with a disability, find a job and connect me with employers in my hometown that were willing to hire folks with disabilities. Now, I realize how awful that sentence sounds, but that's what it was like. Now, Beth was incredible, and she eventually connected me with the Chamber of Commerce. And the director at the time, his name was Dave Hanks. And she said, Dave would like you to come in for an interview, talk about the job, and go from there. So I did all the things. I got dressed up in my nice outfit and my little suit, and I showed up at the Chamber of Commerce and shook Dave's hand, and we went to his office. And the first thing that he did was ask me about my qualifications. He saw that I had some office experience, and once he decided that I had all of the qualifications for the job, then he asked me about my disability. And we went around the office and talked about what accommodations I might need in order to make this job work. Now, my official title was going to be an information specialist. And this Chamber of Commerce in particular not only serviced the community, but it was also an information center. So lots of people would stop and ask us for things to see in the state of Wyoming. So my job was going to be answering the phones and just other random office duties, but my other job was going to be working at the counter and showing folks the things to see in the state. So we got to the counter and he was like, what sort of accommodations might you need for the counter? And I remember looking at the counter being very high, and I said, well, listen, I can get out of my wheelchair and sit on the counter, but I think that's going to be a bit jarring for people. So I said, maybe we can just get a stool with a little cushion on it so I can get a little bit taller, so then I can actually write on the map to show people things to see. And he was like, great. The washroom was accessible to me. They did have a basement, but there was no reason for me to be going in the basement. So that's all I needed, was a stool and a cushion. Dave Hanks gave me my very first job, and what was so important about this job is he saw me as a viable employee first. And then he also saw me as a person with a disability. Both of those things were super important because I was qualified, and yes, I do have a disability and would need a few accommodations. I worked for Dave all throughout my high school career, and then even one summer I came back from university and worked at the Chamber of Commerce for a summer. I was so grateful for this opportunity with Dave. Now, that was my first job. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about what I do, where I started, some of the jobs that I've had, and what I do now. I went to university at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I got my degree in communication. And while I was living in Utah, I got a job at Old Navy, and it was a very similar experience to the Chamber. They saw me as a viable employee first, recognized that I had a disability, and the only accommodation that I needed again was a stool with a little cushion so I could reach the cash register. After I finished school, I left Utah and I moved to Arizona, thinking all my dreams were going to come true. But that didn't happen. I could not get a job as a broadcast journalist, so I worked retail for a while and eventually landed a job working at a salon and spa, answering phones, and eventually climbing their corporate ladder to become one of their client operations directors. But this wasn't the job of my dreams. It gave me all the things that I wanted and needed, but I was looking for something more than just money and stuff. So in 2007, a good friend of mine called and invited me to go on a volunteer trip to East Africa to help build a school with them. And initially I thought, if I can't find happiness here in North America, how am I going to find it in East Africa? But after a long chat with my friends and family, I decided to go because if I was going to make any sort of change, I had to get outside of my comfort zone and take a risk. So in 2008, I went to Kenya and I instantly fell in love, specifically with the sunsets and the people. And the moment that changed everything for me is when we arrived at one of the new schools and literally 300 kids came running out and they circled around me and they were laughing and giggling and talking a mile a minute in a language I had no idea what they were saying. They were eager to ask me a bunch of questions to get to know me, and after I answered everything, a young girl said to me that she didn't know something like this, meaning the loss of my legs, could also happen to white people too. And that one phrase changed my entire journey and helped me recognize that my disability wasn't just something that happened to me, it was a tool that I could use to empower people to look at the world differently, empower people to get involved with something that they cared about. And for the first time, I could use it to my advantage. And it became my competitive edge. So when I came back home to North America, I couldn't go back to my normal life. So I applied for a job to work for the non-for-profit that I'd volunteered with, which was based here in Canada. Flew out for an interview, similar to the Chamber and similar to Old Navy. They saw me as a viable employee first, and it was my disability that actually I think was my competitive edge and got me the job. Now I did need a few accommodations. Their buildings weren't as accessible, so they put in a lift so that I could get into the building. But other than that, everything else was great. What's interesting is the friend that took me to East Africa used to tell me you should be a motivational speaker. And initially I was like, what am I going to talk about? It seems so narcissistic to share my story. And there's this weird sort of thing with disabled folks that everyone always wants you to share your story with them or with their classroom or their Rotary Club. And every now and then I would do it, but it just always felt so shallow to me to be like, this is me, I have a disability, this is my medical history. And then you'd get the dread of like, you're so inspiring. And it's like, me living my life is not inspiring. Anyway, when I moved to Canada to work for the non-for-profit, I became a motivational speaker. My job was to speak on behalf of them, and I was traveling like 200 days out of the year, doing roughly 100 speeches or more. And then in the summer, I would spend time in East Africa or India hosting volunteer trips. All of that training that I'd gone through customer service and studying acting and communication in school led me to this point to become a motivational speaker. And with the help of some incredible folks and mentors, I became successful. Through this organization, I was able to climb Kilimanjaro and raise $500,000 for clean water and do a bunch of other fun campaigns and get to meet some celebrity ambassadors like Demi Lovato. And then I went on tour with her. I've since moved on from that organization and now I run my own business. I have someone that manages my speaking career. And then I'm talking to you, which means I'm also here on social media. And what a typical day for me looks like if I have a keynote is sometimes I travel to that city, there's a tech check that I need to do, and then I do the engagement, and then there's all the travel to come back home, and I love it. So why am I sharing all of this with you? Let's go to the couch and I'll tell you. If it wasn't for Beth Whitman and that government program that I found all those years ago that helped me get my first job at the Chamber of Commerce, I don't know where I would be today. I'm sure eventually I would find employment, but I know that I would have felt really discouraged and it would have been really difficult for me to navigate all of this without knowing that these sort of programs exist. And what's really interesting is that my story is not a unique story. And what I mean by that is there are so many disabled folks that have had the same experience and continue to have this experience. For me, I had to carve out my own path, and luckily I found organizations along the way that recognize the skills that I had and help nurture those, which is why programs like this are so important. Not only does it help folks with disabilities connect with people that will hire them, which, again, in 2025, I can't believe we're still saying this, but it's still a thing. But it also helps us understand what's possible and helps folks with disabilities that have all these incredible talents and skills that they just want to be able to put to good use and earn a living like everyone else. It helps connect them. Now, here in Canada, we have something called CASE, the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, and they are actually the sponsor of today's video. CASE is a national organization that is all across Canada with an incredible network of service providers and community partners helping folks with disabilities connect with employment and find and retain competitive jobs. They also have incredible resources and online courses for employees and employers to help make the workplace more inclusive for folks with disabilities. And these types of organizations are helping people understand the ableism that exists out there, which prevents folks like me from having a successful job, and breaking down those barriers and providing those opportunities. So Beth Whitman, if you're watching, thank you. All right, folks, that's it for this week. So lovely to see you. And as always, if you haven't yet, like and subscribe and comment and hit the bell and all the things, and I'll see you soon. Bye.